So shall I start?
I think there are a lot of attendees just joining.
Okay, so just let
The
me,
numbers
I
are
can't
going
really
really
tell. Oh, I
quick.
see what you're saying. Yeah,
It's running like a taxi meter in a signal.
That's right.
indeed. Indeed.
So, Deborah, maybe you need to conduct and say this way, park over here, and
Exactly. No. We will be starting very shortly. We're just going to make sure that all the people that are trying to sign in are on, and we'll get started. Thank you again for joining. Just a few more, just a minute or two to be respectful of everyone's time. Great. Okay. Well, we're going to get started. Welcome everyone to the webinar. My name is Deborah Drake, and I lead the Center for Financial Inclusion's, what we call CFI's, investor engagement and research efforts. The Weathering the Storm 2 publication was conducted as part of our partnership with the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth and produced with the European Microfinance Platform. So it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to gather this esteemed group of microfinance leaders to share their experiences in managing past crises, as well as the current pandemic. So even though living and working through a crisis is painful, as we all know, and stressful, coming through at the end leaves one stronger and so much wiser. So we're here today to gather those bits of wisdom and prepare ourselves for the next stage of the current crisis, which is recovery. This webinar is going to focus on recovery. What does it look like? How did you know your institution was in recovery? What are the lessons that we can take away from past crises to help us navigate our recovery from the current one? So this is a discussion amongst all of us. It's not really a presentation. It's really that we're here to answer questions. We're here to have a discussion. And for those of you who have not had the opportunity to take a look at the Weathering the Storm publication, you can find that publication on the CFI website, which is up in the chat. And you will also find on the CFI website some blogs that have discussed some of the specific cases that are in the Weathering the 2 publication. You'll also find access to other materials that are related to the Weathering the Storm journey that we've all taken, and you'll hear a little bit more about. If you're looking for some specific summaries of the cases, again, the representatives are here from many of them. You can look specifically on pages 6 and 7 of the Weathering the Storm publication to get some background, as we're not going to be spending a lot of time talking about the actual specific events of these prior crises. As all of you familiar with Zoom know, we really appreciate your comments in the chat box. Any particular questions, because this is really meant, again, to be a conversation with all of you. Please put them in the Q&A and we will be answering them either if they're relevant to what we're talking about at the moment or at the end, but please do put in your questions. There'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. So looking forward to a conversation with everyone around the room. Wish we could all be at a table talking to each other in chairs, but we'll get started. And so we'll get started with Daniel Rosas. Daniel is a senior microfinance expert at the European Microfinance Platform. He's a consultant and a researcher on a broad range of topics. He is the author of Weathering the Storm. So based in Brussels, he's also the co-founder of the Mimosa Project, which provides a methodological assessment of market saturation and risk of over-indebtedness for microfinance markets. Prior to his microfinance career, Daniel worked for the US mortgage company Fannie Mae during the years 2001 to 2008, where he had firsthand experiences with the extraordinary boom and bust cycle that took place in the United States mortgage market during this period. So he has also not only written about, but has experienced crises. So Daniel, could you give us a little background on Weathering the Storm 2, why you wrote it, and why is it called Weathering the Storm 2?
Absolutely. Well, taking the last question first, sometimes the easiest title is the one that you just can't figure it out. So just following the traditional Hollywood methodology, you don't do a sequel, you just put a 2 on it. I'm not promising Weathering the Storm 3, at least not for a long time.
We hope not.
Exactly. Yeah, so to kind of think about why did we come out with this paper, sometime in summer of last year, when in the early part of the summer of last year, where things were really accelerating quickly, there was a lot of uncertainty as to what's going on, how will COVID develop. The original Weathering the Storm, which was published in 2011, I think it came out at the very beginning of 2011, but mostly referenced the events that took place between 2008 and 2010. That was being circulated fairly widely in the sector, and people sort of were referencing, okay, well, if you have to go through a crisis, what kind of things should you be paying attention to? Is there a guide of some sort you could follow? And the issue with that paper is, while it was good, it was fairly old. It was already 10 years old at that point. But more importantly, the original premise of the first paper was actually not how to weather a storm, but how to avoid one in the first place.
Mhm.
Like, what do you do to not get into crisis? Either sort of signs you could watch out for, and warnings you could be alert for. And only the last section of the paper was actually, okay, now you're in crisis, you failed the first part of it, what do you do next? So it was a relatively short part of the paper, but that was the one that really was important during COVID. So the idea was, can we go back and actually elaborate more on this crisis survival? No one can argue that there's any financial institution that could have done anything to avoid the COVID pandemic. There's truly one of those external crises. Maybe could have been handled better by health authorities and governments. That's a separate issue. But when it comes to our institutions, we are where we are. And so the idea was could we look for cases that would both be more relevant for the kind of situation that COVID seemed to imply, and also really go deeper into, okay, crisis survival. And that is the core of Weathering the Storm 2. So it not only adds the new cases, there are 5 of them. One of them is the Viator Microfinance from Azerbaijan, which is we're very lucky to have Ainur, who was the leader of the organization from the beginning of the crisis that hit Azerbaijan in 2015. And then another case was from India that we drew, going back to the Andhra Pradesh crisis in 2010. And this is a case that Srinivasan research, and both of them will talk about their examples. But we also went back to the original case studies. So there were 10 in the original series, and one of them was Kashf Foundation. And one of the things that we did is we reached out to Roshana again, and to kind of see, not only kind of catch up to where, what happened in the 10 years since the paper was published. So Kashf originally, hit its early crisis in 2008. The paper was published, all the research was done in 2010, but it was actually still going through the process. And so one of the issues was to see, okay, what happens on the long term? And I think one of the most interesting parts of the paper is this ability to take the long-term view. So we went back and we looked at all of the cases that we could get data on. And in fact, all the institutions that survived, so there were some in the original paper that actually did fail, but those who survived, we were able to get data and sort of do a long-term trend line. And I'll actually share one chart. If you look in the chat box, if you could just hit that link, you will see the chart. What this really shows you is a 10-year view of institutions that hit crisis and how long did it take them to get out of it. Just using their gross loan portfolio as the indicator. In this case, of course, a crisis affects many things. You're dealing with clients, you're dealing with staff, you're dealing with capital, with liquidity. But portfolio is obviously one of the core issues that you're dealing with in a credit institution. So one of the things that really stood out is the incredible number of years that it takes institutions to merge. So you can see that only one of the institutions of these of the ones here actually managed to emerge before year 5, where their portfolio got back to where it was at the pre-crisis level. Many others took 5, 6, 7 years. Some of them are, still dealing with crisis today. Obviously, not all of them have a 10-year cycle. So, for example, Viator, the crisis began 2015. We're only 5 years out at this point, as of the time of this paper. So I think this is a particularly relevant issue. And one of the many things that come out of the paper is to say, if we're in COVID and the crisis is serious and some institutions will be hit more, others will be hit less, but especially those who are really hit severely, does this mean that, in fact, we're looking at 2025 or 2026 or 2027 as the years when things will finally normalize? That's a long time. And so I think this is exactly one of the questions to really explore and dig down, and I hope we'll be able to do it. So I'm sorry, I took my introduction way longer than necessary, but hopefully that gives an opening of why the paper and why it's relevant today.
Thanks, Daniel. Now let's hear a little bit from our leaders who've gone through this. I'm going to start out with Ainur. So Ainur, Ainur Alieva is the CEO of the non-bank credit organization Viator Microcredit Azerbaijan. Ainur started with the institution in 2004 as a chief accountant, moved up the ladder to become finance minister, then deputy director, and in 2015 was promoted to chairman of the management board. She is also on the board of EMFA, the Azerbaijan Microfinance Association. So my question to you, Ainur, you were thrown unexpectedly into a leadership role when the crisis occurred because the CEO was actually out of the country. How did that affect your approach to managing the crisis at that time? And if you could travel back in time, what advice would you give that novice CEO? And you're on mute. You're on mute. Yeah. Still on mute. Yeah. Let's try again.
I think the organizers can unmute her.
Ah, there you go. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're fine. Go ahead.
So what would be my advices for the, if I come back to that very stressful period? First of all, first advice is just to keep himself very quiet and calm. So no stress, just stop and think what to do. Secondly, think only about the financial effects and less about the human feelings. Sometimes you think that if I go for this step, it can hurt something, because we did a lot of shortcuts, cuts of stuff. That's why what was needed, and close some departments because we had a very stressful situation. The devaluation, we faced with devaluation in December and in February. The third advice is to be patient and just go ahead with your plans, and the best way will come at the end. Because during all these 5 years, we faced a lot of pop-ups and with a lot of different situations. And what we did, let's say, this crisis taught us to be flexible. It means that just to be flexible is just to change your mind. So sometimes I remember that we had to change our strategy at all, because the situation demands that. And finally, we managed just to go to this, let's say, green line. And after that, again, COVID and the war, so it will become to another questions.
Thank
Thank you, Anur. Thank you. So Roshana, Roshana is a pioneer in the development sector with an experience of over 30 years. She is the only Pakistani woman to have established the country's first specialized microfinance institution, Kashf Foundation, that works towards empowering women micro-entrepreneurs. Roshana also serves on the board of several prestigious institutions, including Pakistan Medical Commission, Kennard College, Finca Microfinance Bank, the Microinsurance Network, Pakistan Microfinance Network, and Carbon Crafts. Her contribution to the development field has been recognized internationally and nationally. In 2005, she was awarded the Tamga-e-Imtiaz, one of Pakistan's highest civilian awards by the President of Pakistan for all of her work in empowering women from low-income households. So, Roshana, thinking back all these years and now, Kashf made many changes and adaptations in response to the crisis in 2008. So how important was adaptation to a sustained recovery? And what adaptations do you expect will be necessary to emerge from the present crisis? Tell us.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. That's a very profound question, and it requires, several layers of responses. But I'll try and keep it simple so we can continue the discussion. So one of the elemental things we did, we changed the ethos of microfinance. We had replicated the Grameen Bank. I'm going back in time now. And we had started with introducing for the first time the solidarity lending model in Pakistan. It hadn't been tried and tested, with women at the center of it all. So it's the entire epicenter or the raison d'etre of the work we did was women entrepreneurs. And that model had weakened over the years. A lot of times, we had group fatigue, we had issues of due diligence, we had issues of monitoring, we had issues of pipelining in terms of who was using the loan. So the transparency and the objectivity of the model had, lost its strength and robustness. And when the financial crisis hit and when inflation hit in August 2008, we had the highest levels of food inflation in Pakistan, which immediately, and it's interesting, that's happening right now as well, but things are different. The context is very different. So food inflation went up to 14%. So that triggered the crisis at one level, along with the fact that after 10 years of having dictatorship in the country, we had democracy and a lot of populism was afoot in terms of whether it was generalized loan write-offs or by the politicians, local politicians. So that generated an entire stress for the industry. So the first thing we did really was changing the model, and we moved from the core solidarity lending model to the individual lending model. Mm. And that's really what was the key change we made. And the second thing we did at that time, which has also held us in good stead over the next decade or so, was using information technology. In those days, it wasn't digital footprint. It was more information technology. How good are the tracking systems, loan tracking systems we use? How quickly do we get the data? And the third thing we did was we changed the nomenclature of the loan officer, because loan officers were seen as very transactional. We call them business development officer. The idea being that as an organization, we had a stake in the business of the entrepreneur. So and at one level, we also did the whole value chain for women entrepreneurship. So we added the microfinance plus. So if I look back, those were the four things we changed. And those are really what have kept us afloat even in this crisis. And I want to just wrap up very quickly, but I want to answer Daniel's question. How quickly are we going to address this crisis? Actually, Daniel, we're back to our pre-COVID portfolio size already. So it took us under 14 months to hit the number. So obviously, we've learned from the earlier crisis and the traction in terms of making decisions on the fly. Basically, what we had to do as part of this crisis was we didn't know where it was going to pan out. So we needed to make daily decisions. And we used the same ethos we had done earlier. We got a management committee going. We got communication going. We used technology. We got Zoom calls going. We didn't lay off any staff. We communicated with the clients. These are all the things we did even in the earlier crisis. We contacted each and every client. We understood, we listened to them. We saw that they were having difficulty paying. We rescheduled. We customized the rescheduled plan. We introduced capitalization loans. So all these things happen. Now, to answer the final question that Deborah had, what is this going to do to the face of the industry? Definitely, the digital footprint is going to be much larger. So already, if, for example, at Kashf, we are moving on to mobile banking for our clients and helping them open mobile accounts where all the transactions will happen. So doing away with cash completely. That's definitely going to happen. Rescheduling is here to stay. I think flexibility in the products we offer, customization, more trade-based lending, because some of the things we saw, there were certain sectors that were affected more negatively than others. So the risk analysis will change for different trades. You can't have one size fits all. So lots of these learnings happening as we move forward. You know, the downside of this was our credit scoring is out of the window. It's simply not working at the moment. So we really have to do the algorithms again. And I was just going through all the APIs this morning, and none of them sync in with get credit behavior today. So we'll have to wait. That's where the normalization is going to take longer. So I'll just stop here.
Now that's really interesting, an interesting consequence of this. And I'm really happy to hear that things are really back to whatever normal, the new normal is, but that you're back to your COVID level of portfolio. That is great news. I'm not sure that's true across the board, but that is fantastic news. So congratulations on that. Well, moving just a little bit further down in the map, we have here Mr. Srinivasan, who has 4 decades of experience, including 25 years as a development banker, focused on development finance and rural livelihoods. And over the last 13 years, he has advised the design, the supervision, the evaluation of several development finance projects, and both in India and abroad. So apart from India, he has advised policy authorities and projects in financial inclusion and development banking and microfinance and livelihoods in Vietnam and Myanmar, Laos, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Tanzania. I could keep going on and on and on. And he is a very well-known writer. He has authored multiple State of India livelihood reports. He has also done 4 of what we're all very familiar with, which is Microfinance India, State of the Sector reports, published books on rural finance and corporate responsibility, and he's also a board member on many development organizations and networks. So talk about understanding profound changes that we've seen in India and elsewhere. My question to you is, and it's pretty obvious from what I've just said, you've witnessed and played key roles in previous crises of the microfinance sector in India. So how do you see the current crisis, in the context of the history of the sector in India and the way forward? And take yourself off mute.
Yeah, mostly people wonder in meetings how to keep me muted. After Zoom came, yeah, people say you will now come off mute. So you should stop me when you think it's too much. Yeah, I would say that both Ainur and Roshane are in tougher places. People like me and Daniel are, can stand by the side and say, look, this is what you did. You could have done differently, and this is where you could have reached, with no clear, pathway from what we suggest to where it will come to. Meaning the nature of the crisis, whether the past, the ones that came in between or the present, they have been quite complex, and they don't seem to repeat themselves in terms of what they do to us as a sector. When I look at the AP crisis and its predecessors, one side of this business was getting impacted, meaning the supply side, whether law said that, look, we will make it difficult for you to do business. The livelihoods, the income flows, as long as people were active, that was not getting impacted. We had a subsequent larger event we ran across the entire country in India, that when we demonetized high value notes, the livelihoods were not impacted, but then any cash saving they had, they were not very useful to repay if they were in high denomination notes. Because the fragility of income flows, if you don't repay 2 installments, because during that period you are trying to get new currency, you find your money is already spent. So it took 6 months to 1 year in many cases. In one or two MFIs, they had to write down quite a bit of their portfolio, arising from purely something like your currency is not legal tender, you have to get a new one in exchange. But now the problem is both sides are being impacted. The demand side, people's livelihoods have been impacted. There are a significant number of people who have lost what they were doing for earning their income, whether it is wage labor or whether it is self-employed services, small petty trade and all that. On the supply side, the MFIs have found by and large that liquidity is not that easy to come by, number one. Even if you come by liquidity, you have to preserve it so that you can service your liabilities rather than try and put money in the customer's hands who require it much more. This crisis is impacting both sides. So it is somewhat atypical compared to the earlier one. So the effort in terms of how we rectify things here is much more a collaborative effort and should continue to be so. The regulator has a role to play. The investors, funders have a role to play, which I think Daniel had brought out in between in one of his posts about liquidity being the king in this. And from the customer side, how fast we try and reinstate their livelihood, their income flows, which makes the loans serviceable and fresh loans becoming a possibility. So in terms of the nature and typology of the crisis, this actually belongs in a much different sphere, a much higher level, because several other stakeholders have to really come together to see that. But the good news is that unlike say 10 years back, today all the stakeholders understand the importance. You look at the shareholder, the equity holders' response, the bulk funders' response, the regulators' response. This has been much more positive, forthcoming, to a degree even proactive in several countries. And in India particularly, I would say that Reserve Bank has really been proactive. Right in March 2020, they said that, okay, you probably have to give a moratorium on repayment of loans at the customer level, and counterparty, we will try and see whether the liquidity flows to you in terms of loans from banks can be freed up. So they introduced some mechanism. Even last week, there was one more dose of guaranteed funding made available to MFI, with the government and the Reserve Bank putting their heads together. The issues are how much is internal to the MFIs, which both Ainur and Hosani talked about. They could do so many things to get the reading of the customer right, trying to categorize their, problems into different buckets and see what can be dealt with by patients, what will be dealt with better by putting more loans into them so they revive, and what part is something we'll have to take a hit. So let us deal with that accordingly. So this they will do, then try and tweak the internal processes, change the nature of the products and all that. But then the support that is required from other levels, it was not available in the past, but I think it is available much better now. There are only 2-3 issues I would just refer to then when I close down. One is in terms of the underlying situation on microfinance. Generally, maybe some geographies might be exempt from what I am saying. That has changed. Group, joint group liability as a concept, I don't see it existing in most locations. And even the inclination to come together in groups to borrow, that seems to have declined big time. People have better use of time than attend periodic meetings. So they send their neighbor, their child, husband, somebody, okay, you go and repay this money. Today is my group meeting day, repayment day. This is something that's creeping up. The second is the technology that's now available in greater measure, that's making the life of the MFI slightly easier if they are adopting that, if they are able to bring on board both in processes and in the structure of products. This could in some ways make the job of analyzing the borrower behavior easier. So when crisis come, even at the early stage, we could actually look at some of the, and I think the third is the better feel for and about microfinance as a sector. So banks do not shy away that much, at least in India. They are willing to come and put money in, provide the ongoing liquidity. So the general idea is if you can get $1 of equity, yeah, we could somehow get another $5-6 of loan, and then we can do a business of it. So you look at when the crisis hit in 2010, if we had around 45-50 commercial microfinance institutions, today there are about 80 of them. And we do have new institutions coming up almost every year, a few. But then the scale of the crisis here with about 110 million borrowers, even one small state having an impact is fairly large. In the northeastern state of Assam, we are just now going through a crisis which is now winding down to its last stages. The haircut that will be taken by banks in that one state, it's about $600 million, which will be a crisis in a country in some places. Yeah, I'll stop here. Maybe we continue discussion later.
Great. No, thanks. Very, very, very interesting. You mentioned the role of the regulator, and indeed, in the past, regulators have played a very important role in the resolution of crisis in the financial sector, at least in some countries, maybe not in all countries. Roshana, can you give me a sense of how can you compare your experience with the regulators, let's say 10 years ago, with what you have seen now with the pandemic?
So yeah, again, a very good question, Deborah, because 10 years ago, I would say the sector didn't really have an owner. There wasn't that onus that any regulator would come in and support us. We had the microfinance banks that were emerging. So the state bank, which is our central bank, was responsible for their fiduciary, role. But in terms of the non-banking microfinance companies, which was the NGOs, MFIs, essentially, there was no one. We were just the stepchild of the sector. So if we raised a voice, nobody heard us at that stage. But over the years, there has been regulation and it has been strengthened. So all of us now fall between two ambits. We have the Security Exchange Commission of Pakistan that looks at the non-banking microfinance companies, and then we have the state bank. So very early on in the crisis, the state bank and the SECP and the Pakistan Microfinance Network got together and started a conversation. All stakeholders met on the same table. And one of the first things the state bank did was it asked the commercial banks to automatically reschedule all our loans by 12 months, which meant that we didn't have to make payments on our commercial debt till 12 months later, which was March this year. So that gave us liquidity. And as already mentioned by Mr. Rao, that this is critical. Liquidity at this juncture is very critical because you want to meet your obligations. Similarly, we were given the policies for rescheduling our clients, and we didn't have to provision for them the same way that we did for our earlier provisioning. So it relaxed, both regulators relaxed the rescheduling for the client. So again, that helped us manage our financials. So these were the two, immediate steps. And then there were conversations to see how much liquidity was required, how that needed to be planned. So very quickly, the state bank rolled out a microcredit financial guarantee for us, which we are now accessing to get commercial debt. So the good thing was that this time around, everybody was talking, like Mr. Rao has also mentioned, that all the stakeholders sat on the same table. Microfinance is taken seriously. 10 years ago, we were not taken that seriously at all. Now this is a sector, it's an industry, it has value, it brings something to the table. And we are consulted. So that was really the difference. And then as an industry also, the network was more coalesced. We were more coordinated. And we had more data to share. I think one of the good things this time around was last time we were all blindsided. We didn't really know. Now we had the Credit Information Bureau to tell us exactly who was defaulting, what the over-indebtedness was for each client. We had the what we call it the digital identity verified of our clients as well from the government system. We also had the data that the Pakistan Microfinance Network had. So we could analyze what the numbers were telling us, where risks were rising, and we could take those steps much faster than we did in the past. So I think all of this combined, that's why I was saying that the turnaround time in this particular crisis, even though I agree with Mr. Rao that the incomes of our clients have been affected pretty badly. And I was just looking at the data we did in April 2021. We did a survey of our clients. 69% of them are saying that their income hasn't reverted back to pre-COVID levels. Only 16% are saying that their income has reverted or has increased than pre-COVID levels. So they are being hit. But the resilience of these households is amazing. And I'll just quote one more example and then I'll stop. When we designed our rescheduling for our clients post, the COVID lockdowns, we had assumed that clients, like we were given the option to do a 12-month rescheduling with commercial banks, our clients would also, access that option. So we had a series of options. We said you could reschedule for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and so on and so forth. Well, almost 90% of our clients rescheduled for within the 90-day bandwidth, which meant they were more optimistic than the microfinance industry was. And the remaining 10% went for the 12-month option. We've recovered 93% of the portfolio of COVID already, and the remaining 7%, we're assuming we'll probably have to write off about 5%, is what we've assumed. And even those clients that have gone, that have been submerged by the crisis are, this wasn't a willful default, it wasn't intentional, it was a circumstantial default. So we are looking at mechanisms to bring them back.
That's absolutely fascinating and incredibly optimistic. I mean, that's incredible. Yeah, to know that. That's great. I'm glad that you brought that up. Gives you a lot of hope. And it was interesting also that, because this was a question I was going to also make to you, is the role of these microfinance networks like the PMN that you're involved in, and just the role that they've played and grown into over the last 10 years. So yeah, I'd like to ask the same question to you, Anur. Can you tell us a little bit about the role of AMFA, what you've seen in terms of microfinance associations, how the role it's played in the past as well, and what you're seeing now. And then in addition, can you tell all of us a little bit about the role of the regulator, what the regulator has or has not done in Azerbaijan? I don't think a lot of us are as familiar as to what has been happening in your country with respect to the response to COVID.
I'm sorry, the first question was
the role of AMFA, the Azerbaijan Microfinance Association.
About the role of AMFA in Azerbaijan. So this is our microfinance network, which was created in 2004, and at that time Viator was on the market and was one of the first members of AMFA. And also, Viator is also one of the shareholders of AMFA. So I would say shortly that AMFA is like the mother for all MFIs, because in Azerbaijan, the banks is a different, very different world, and MFIs is another small world. And all supports, I would say fairly, that all support from our regulator, central bank, was focused on the banks and not on the MFIs. Just a little bit on MFIs. If we go for the history, MFIs were almost all MFIs, and Viator also was established on the base of the grants from Europe and also USA. And this was very supportive for the financial market in general. And at that time, it was just after the first Karabakh war. There were no businesses, and there was a very young Republic of Azerbaijan, and really support from abroad was really very helpful. And at that time, AMFA has been created and just collected all these small MFIs, all supportive projects from Europe, from UNDP, and a lot of social and financial sectors. I would say that AMFA was on the top of all these processes and took a very active part, and also continued to take part in the decision, in the law creation for MFIs. During last 7 years, and it was just in 2018, we had a supervisory body of financial market. It was somehow some kind of supervisory organization, which was created by a central bank, who was particularly dealing with MFIs. It was very strict with a very special, conditions, and it was very hard to work with that. We call this Palata, and finally in 2000, I guess it was in 2018, it was just stopped their activity, and again we were joined to a central bank. And at that time, ANFA really demonstrated very high, let's say, power just to defend MFIs, because they just drafted a few laws about MFIs. And when I read it, I just decided, okay, we have to close down MFIs and go home. And they managed under Parliament just to stop this and to re-review this again. And when the second review time came, this supervisory body was just, closed down. So we're lucky. And so now central bank again working on the new law. During all these 15 years, while I'm here, and there was no special law for MFIs. All regulations, all these, reports were on the base of the law for the banks. That's why right now, ANFA also just sent some package of the proposals, which we discussed with other MFIs, and I am being the board member of ANFA. We just signed and sent the supportive letter to central bank saying that yes, and at the first proposal there were special changes that you have to just focus on them, that those changes should be done just to increase the activity of MFIs. Right now we can see that regulator are now about the regulator really changed for the last 3 or 4 years. They are more open. They would like just to listen our views, to listen our proposals, what our problems, and ANFA is like a bridge, between central bank and all MFIs, because right now we have 45 MFIs in Azerbaijan. Most of them are local, just a few, like one of them, Viator, is just foreign share with the foreign shareholders. What they did for us during last years, I would say there was no special support directly from the central bank. I'm the finance person, that's why I'm always thinking about money. So there was no subordinated, grants or any financial support. No, just they just make some link between some funds. We call this AKIA and SKMF. This is some supportive funds for the small business in Azerbaijan, and also supported cheap loans, I would say, which for the agriculture, but they are not very suitable for Viator. I would say that way, because they are very, these funds are very suspicious. They have very suspicious approach to MFIs. They think that we are not that serious, we are small because we lend small money, and they have a lot of very hard, procedure and hard conditions. I would say that this is suitable for the banks because they apply for the bigger amount, and there is sense just to work on these conditions. For another 50,000 or let's say 10,000 for one client is not, I think there is no sense to work on that. That's why we do not use this kind of support from the government. From my side, what I can say, thank you to our central bank. When this COVID pandemic just occurred, all organizations were locked down. There was no permission to work. Only banks permitted to work. And after that, they decided we just send a letter saying that, okay, we're doing the same process. We have the same clients, we live in the same country. And they just make for us this jest and allowed for us to work during all this very hard time during pandemic. And it was really very helpful for us just to collect the funds and also to support our clients and just to be with our clients. That's it.
Well, thank you. That's really interesting. And I'm glad that things have been able to move forward in the past year. Wow, quite an experience. Roshana, question for you. I know, unfortunately, you have to leave us shortly, but I think this is something that a lot of people have been thinking about, is that much has been said about the support from investors during the COVID-19 crisis, especially from the debt side, with respect to streamline and coordinated rescheduling as you're saying, and restructuring procedures. But what do you think should be the role of equity investors now that we're getting to the point of sort of liquidity, moving into questions of solvency? Hope, you know, so it doesn't sound like it's in your case, but what do you feel should be the role of equity investors? What kind of response would you like to see from them?
So this is an interesting question because we have a perspective of having invested in the FinCA microfinance bank. So we are an investor in FinCA, and that's why I'm on board. So it's an interesting question because you really, you know, the dynamic has changed. It's unpredictable. It's the feasibilities that you had for the year, the KPIs that you had for the year, you just had to throw them out of the window. You couldn't meet those. So pushing the management to actually meet those requirements is not fair. That's one. The second thing is that as an investor, we really need to see, we need to bring those clients back. So one of the things we've done on this particular microfinance bank was to actually segment the point that Mr. Rao was making earlier also, that you need to segment your market. So that's what we did for the bank. We said, okay, this is the more profitable segment. So we continue focusing on that, and that will become the cash cow for now. However, the ROIs and the ROAs are all going to be out of sync right now. And then there is the maintenance where we need to recover this money. So we have to come up with new ways of doing that. So I think as an investor, one of the things we've learned is that in a crisis, you have to have flexibility. You have to look at new parameters, set up new benchmarks. You have to have the information to bifurcate the business into profitable and maintenance, or I wouldn't say unsustainable, but crisis hit sections of your portfolio or the trades that you fund. You also will have to, one of the things that as investors we've done, at least with the bank here, is to look at the possibility of new markets, because that's something that this crisis has shown. You can't, and that was what the earlier crisis also showed, that you can't have your eggs in one basket. So I think with the digital option available, we are seeing a lot of investors and banks moving into, for example, in Pakistan, in nano loans. So the market there is pretty lucrative and the returns are high, and so and the risk is not as high because your loan sizes are smaller. So you'll have it's a high volume business, but it's a quick turnaround business too. So I think that's another thing that's happening with digital footprints, though there is a downside to this, as we all know, where you're using that data to basically bully the clients to repay, which we all know has happened in certain markets. Or that money is being used, as we know, in Kenya after 11 p.m. and is used for gambling. So there is an ethical side to this as well, but there is a panning out of new segments as well. So as investors, I think one of the roles that we need to play is to be patient, to be more aligned with the business, to see the risks. We will not be getting very good returns this year, but as long as we support the pipeline and the systems of the organization, we will reap benefits in the coming years. So I think this year we'll have to, and then the write-offs, they're going to be huge write-offs. So the difference between, and I'll stop after this, but it's an interesting comparison. The difference between the non-banking microfinance companies in Pakistan and the microfinance banks was, as I shared with you, most of the non-banking microfinance companies rescheduled for within 90 days. That's how their market panned out. But the banks automatically rescheduled for 12 months. So in March is when their real, portfolios at risk started showing up, and suddenly they had this huge delinquency crisis with only 46 to 50% recovery coming in. Many of their loans were bullet loans, and were not backed by EMI loans. So these were the kind of differences we are seeing. And most of the banks are for profit. So the market in the for-profit space for now is going to be, we'll have to probably recapitalize these banks because they are going to take a hit. So we need to have deep pocket investors, and investors need to pump the money back. So I think these are some of the lessons that.
I think you're bringing up some really questions that actually I've been thinking about it quite a bit at CFI. The whole issue of like, are we going to be seeing some consolidation coming down the pipeline? It's where are we going to see that? And I think the whole issue of really seeing what the quality of the portfolios are as moratoria is released in certain countries, because every country is different in how that's having. So really understanding the quality of there. So thank you, Roshan. That's incredibly interesting. And Mr. Srinivasan, I think you're a perfect person to ask this exact same question about the role of the equity investor, and and what do you feel is their role, and what have you seen in between perhaps what you've seen in the past and Spandana's history with equity investors and what you're sort of seeing now in India. And we need you off of mute again.
You see, equity investors, I think they came on board in India fairly early compared to, they saw the size, and they were also led to believe that since there is unlimited demand in the country, there is so much of profit from 1 million hands that they could generate. They came in on that. But also they realized some of the complexities of doing business in the country, because there could be regulation in different places. There are region-based customer resistance issues you come up, getting to understand the local nuances. But by and large, I think they learned fairly quickly. And they have been with some of the major microfinance companies. If I would fault anything, I would say that they didn't want to invest in the medium and small sized MFIs as such. Had they gone to another country, the medium sized one would have probably been one of the top 5 or something. That is the size when you compare. But then they said, look, you are not on the top of the list. You are way below. You are not top 10, not top 15. One set of issues. Of course, people pick and choose how they would like to invest that. Some of them have been fairly sensitive about how they continued with where they have invested, understanding that there will be some kind of crisis. Finance is a kind of business where risk is inherent, and in cycles you get spikes. Also, as long as you. But also there is an issue. There are some investors who thought that, okay, though we are supposed to be running marathon, I will measure in terms of a 100-meter sprint. So each 100 meters you then measure and then say, look, now I will not be able to continue with you if you are doing like this, forgetting you signed up for a marathon. The patience required to ride out maybe 3 or 4 cycles of the local economic downturn, crisis apart. Okay, any place you go, when the local economy goes up by about 2-3 years on the plus, 1 or 2 years comes down, it is nature, it is competition, it is somebody else has started producing the same grains you did at a lower cost, imports, lots of things impact that. So you ride out 3-4 cycles, you know precisely where we are. The patients ride out all these cycles, understanding what's happening, especially in the rural part of microfinance. This is one of the drawbacks I have found. In the sense, the investing people, the kind of people who do the underwriting, who do the due diligence, they didn't have a real rural bias. They understand the business model, the promises made, the ratios. But to understand that there can be other things when it comes to the customer interface, how the product will work, what processes actually help, what does not. Since it's totally unsecured, it's difficult to recover in some cases, and the cost of recovery could be much higher than what you are willing to spend on what you will get back. These are some of the nuances. But today, I think most of the investors have figured out all these issues. They understand this. And I thought during the crisis, their own inclination to invest more where it is required I think it was quite visible. But I would also say that in terms of planning equity, what did the MFIs do? There were some who said that always I am going to be quite high on equity, and I don't mind having a lower leverage ratio. Overall, it makes me fairly comfortable. The point about solvency, which Daniel refers to in all his documents, I think that's a very key issue. Suppose you are very thin on, say, equity, you have a capital adequacy ratio that the regulator requires is, say, 12%. Or 15%. You are just about 16, trying to game the system. Each year's profits will help me do. One crisis, and you are down, you cannot do further business. You have to go to the regulator for an exception. And for an institution which is in default of key regulatory ratios, it is difficult for an investor to convince his investment committee back in his headquarters to put money in. So a good planning would be, I'm comfortable on capital adequacy. I look at the possibility that a crisis could erode my capital by about 3-4% or whatever. So if regulator says X, I am around 1.3, 1.4X on that in the cap. And I look at the next 3-year block and then plan my incremental capital accordingly, prepare so that I don't make incremental capital as an issue of crisis, but about a regular plan which accommodates the possibility of a crisis. So this is a key lesson which many large MFIs in India learned when they had the AP crisis, and they could ride out the subsequent crises which have come maybe 2-3 different occasions. So I would say that the understanding on the part of new investors who come in to invest in equity, that should be fully on board. The investee company should make them understand you are in for the marathon. If you are a short-term investor, you better give me a 2-year loan and get out. You get fixed return, don't come for equity returns on that. But yeah, I think I will leave it there.
That's great. Good. Daniel, what are your thoughts on this?
Absolutely. So Srinivasan, just thinking what you said is, the MFIs that sort of go to the minimum capital that they need based on regulation. Obviously, that's a management decision, but more maybe to the point, it is also very much an investor's decision, because if you're a shareholder, you're on the board, you're willing to approve this. And I have this feeling that equity investors, at least in the past, have for the most part been very happy to invest if the company is doing well and growing, and okay, great. The moment an organization hits a crisis, there seems to be this reluctance. Oh, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm going to wait and see. And they wait a long time. Right? If you look at Spandana, for example, I believe the first time equity investor came back in was 6 years after the AP crisis, 2017 or something, right? It was Kedara, maybe 2016, 2017. Around
about
that.
6-7 years, yeah.
Exactly. And if you look at all of the other weathering the storm cases, with the exception of one, where there's an investor that actually came in and covered losses right from year 2. Everybody else waited at least 5 years, and some never actually got equity investors to this day, including in markets where markets were doing fine and there was growth. So I do have a sense that investors seem to be very reluctant to go in and say, okay, I know this institution hasn't yet fully recovered, but they've weathered the initial period. They seem to be okay. They've stabilized operationally. So that would be a good time to start investing. And it seems like they don't. I think they sort of wait, and they wind up really extending the time it takes an institution to recover because they need to, they can't grow without building up equity first, right? Because they're all operating on this very, very low equity cushion at that point. Some of them actually wait, and they don't write off, or they don't even provision until they have the equity to provision. Right? They literally will find to extend loans, and because what other choice do they have? Right. So I think this is where equity investors could be a bit more risk accepting. If you're going to be, I put in the paper, I sort of called like a socially responsible vulture investment fund. A vulture fund invests in struggling businesses, but the whole point is, like, I know it's struggling, but I'm able to look behind. Sort of look deeper than a typical investor would, and assess this institution based on what it's doing and how it's, and of course you wind up doing it at lower valuations. I mean, there are benefits financially as well. It's a different kind of strategy, but that's sort of, I have a feeling that is needed in the sector. That's not really happening, and maybe arguably it may be just a bit too soon. But I would think starting from this year up into next year, this is kind of what you would expect to start doing this.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's just my thoughts on.
Yeah.
If any,
If I could make a just quick response to what I said, Daryl, you are actually spot on. I found, see, during this crisis, that quite a number of MFIs raised further equity, right? But these are ones which already had a fairly good capital base. The ones which you had planned in advance, which are comfortable. So making a follow-on investment was no great issue for the investor. Look, they're going to consolidate the crisis. If it plays out a bit more also, they will have the strength. But those who are on the borderline, who are breaching things, now you are worried. Am I throwing good money after bad? After all, the investor is responsible to someone who puts money into him or her. So to the ability to invest, to convince your investment committee that this is a risk worth taking. But there is a third category. You are already in deep. And now you have got to rescue that institution. There are some investments made like that. Look, now I'll have to restore the regulatory capital to a level where the lending banks, lending financial institutions can actually continue. If there is a regulatory breach, they won't also come in, then nothing of this will play. So those also came. But an interesting aside is, in the case of Spandana, they had just postponed their, next equity raise around 2009-10. I have written this in the case study. They thought maybe the next year balance sheet will be good, they will get better valuations. Had they gone ahead with that, the problem that it hit, or the time that they have taken to recover, would have been much less, because there would have been a much stronger capital base, which would have made it, all other things that follow from it. I stop it there. Yeah, then. Sorry about that.
I mean, the one thing about equity investors, though, is, I mean, there are some constraints. I mean, in their defense, shall we say, there are some constraints that they face, and particularly in the case of funds that have a closed-end fund, or funds that have already gone beyond their disbursement period, that they may or may not be able to support. And I think herein lies the question of how is the institution poised to recover and really grow? That really is perhaps driving more the question of how to respond than we're in deep, but we have to figure this out, and we're have to rescue this. So I think there are multiple sort of factors behind decisions as to whether or not. And I think in this case, what we're seeing is that there isn't a real clear sense, and I'm just making a sweeping generalization, but there isn't a real clear sense of the strength of all the institutions because of the various moratoria, because of the fact that with some moratoria you didn't have to write off loans, or you did, so you don't really know what the institution is looking like. So I think there's some level of hesitancy there. And I think you all have also pointed out, Srinivas, it's true, that it was simpler, to actually do follow on. I mean, I think the big question is, where are we going to see the new business? Where are the new pipelines? So I think equity, hasn't faced this situation the way debt, funds have, because they've had to go through multiple crises that have really had an impact on their, on the portfolios and the loans. But it is, I think it's, stay tuned. I think this is going to be a very interesting period coming up over the next several months, maybe even year. So yeah, if there's anything else that you would like to say, Daniel, or?
Well, I don't want to make this Let's Bash the Equity Investors webinar. I think that we'll save that for another day. But I think what you said, Srinivas, and this is less about the investors, more about the sort of pre-crisis. You're absolutely right that if there is one very clear sign, so yes, post-crisis, the recovery can be long, but it's also very clear that institutions that had low equity pre-crisis are those that struggle far more than those who had more. And I sort of posit this question. If you look at some of the failed institutions, there are a couple of them that arguably could have survived. Like if you look at their situations at the time,
Yeah.
they don't look so very different from some of the ones that did survive. I'm thinking of one that was in Morocco. I'm thinking of, well, particularly that one because it was a large institution, had many kind of similar issues of fast growth, etc. You know, they clearly had write-offs, but they also had very, very thin equity. And I do wonder if they had had more equity to start with, would they have been in a different position, and that would have made them possible for them to recover. So if there is a useful sort of rule of thumb to come out of this is, yeah, don't, you know, keep your equity high. You know, don't, and there's even a concept in financial sort of is, yes, you can juice your returns by leveraging, but all you're doing is you're just taking on increasing the risk of the investment. So does that really make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So Ainur, I'm back to you with a question. I think I had alluded to actually in the opening remarks, which is, you know, how do we know when our institutions are in recovery? You know, how do you know the moment has kind of come in which you're in recovery? So like in the case of your institution, Viator, you know, the portfolio shrunk dramatically. And, you know, so, you know, growth in loan demand would be one indicator, but feeling that your institution's in a sustained mode of recovery. It's sort of like the way I think several months ago, you really thought India was on the road to recovery, and then you have a second wave of COVID, right? You don't necessarily see what's going on. So feeling assured that your institution's in a sustained recovery mode can be really difficult because of the fact that, and we've talked about it, loan provisioning can go on for extended period of time. And if I remember correctly, in the case of Viator, the last provisioning for the impact of the crisis in your institution didn't actually take place until 2019. Right. So 2019, all of a sudden in 2020, we see the conflict with Armenia, then COVID hits. So I think one question that all of us kind of think about is, you know, how do you manage a new crisis when you're still recovering from an earlier crisis? I think also one of the case studies that we did this time around, which is Vitas Palestine, sort of the same situation of like, do you ever really get out of crisis, or are there different levels of crisis? But would love to hear your perspective on, you know, am I in recovery, and is the institution in recovery, and what is sustained and not? So yeah.
Very interesting questions. Sometimes I feel that it will never end, and the crisis and the fight with the crisis is just my lifestyle. Yeah. Well, I faced in 2015 with a very hard devaluation, and it was really very stressful. And the pressure from the government, pressure from the clients, pressure from the staff, you know, and well, sometimes I felt that will not survive. But then what we decided to do, I mean, this is what just came to my mind, just, okay, if we die, just we should not just wait and our death. We have to fight for that, fight to be alive. And that's why we started to change our strategy. You know, I would say that even every 3 months we change strategy, we change products, we change our approach to our clients. It was very difficult, and we just continue. We were like always in stress, always we were running somewhere. And suddenly we just stopped, and we saw that, yes, we are out of the crisis, we are starting to recovery. Before the devaluation, we had very strong equity. That's why this was really helpful for us just to start recovery. And our portfolio was just reduced almost for the 50%. And before devaluation, the half of our portfolio was in foreign currency. Can you imagine what the situation with the clients? Actually, before devaluation, we made a stress scenario, and we make a forecast for this devaluation, but we assume that it will be 20%, but not 34. Wow. Yeah, and after 3 months, again, around about 50%. So it was really awful and stressful. What was our priority? What we did first? Everybody stopped lending in Azerbaijan, but still there was some people who just wanted just to develop, to continue their businesses. Everybody stopped, and just Viator started to disperse and starting to this lending process. And I remember that my staff, my managers called me saying that, there is a saying that in Azerbaijan, in the regions, we had 7 branches in all of Azerbaijan, and they said that Viator's manager, I think she's crazy. Everybody stopped, but she started to lending. Yes, it was our stress strategy, and after some period, even our lenders, we had a lot of debt at that time. They were really very angry, and they said, "I know what you are doing." I said, "You just trust me, and we will come to our recovery." And after some period, they said, "I know, yes, you were right. It was really a very special strategy, but it was really gave a very good results." At that time, we managed to grab all the best clients in the market. Yeah, because before the devaluation, we had so big competition, and the banks, they really, before that, they really deal with the very big businesses and had some problems on that. And before the devaluation, they just found out that it's very beneficial to have the microfinance in the banks, and they rushed to our market, and that's why the competition really grown, very fast. And and the financial crisis, the devaluation, just showed all these bad strategies of the bank and the people, our clients, and also another clients. Not our clients, but the bank clients. They just became over in debt. And so with this strategy, we started slowly recover. We did a lot of restructuring, stop penalties, made a lot of write-offs, but it would never continue, in a good way if the government would not help us. In 2018, our president really made a very good support for the banks and MFIs also. They just gave the compensation for the USD loans. And also, I would say, personally, Viator got 3 million manat, covered all these USD loans. And after that, we got 1 million manat for the local currency loans, just to continue their businesses, just to close their debts. And the interest rate, it was a very cheap one from central banks, 0.5. And we just put our margin 0.5. And in general, our clients just got the loans, covered their, all loans in all banks by 1% per annum. And the grace period is 2 years. And all this loan is just for 5 years. It was very helpful for the businesses and for MFIs too. We started, what we did with this money, very interesting questions. I know that will come next. What we did first, this is my strategy, all put to portfolio, to increase it, just to go for the development. But the clients, they had a lot of problems. Most of them got a bankrupt during this devaluation process. That's why we were not managed just to put all these funds to our portfolio. We had extra cash on hand. Well, what to do? All our debts to international lenders were still in USD, in foreign currency. And that's why almost half of this money received from the government as a compensation we put for the portfolio. Another part, we covered our debts. Our lenders were very happy because we almost we covered 1 million manat, and for them is around about 700,000 USD. And we still had some funds on hand, starting to continue. We were very happy. And then in 2020, COVID. Again, lockdown, again, they stop all the businesses, the bankrupts, some of our, let's say, wedding businesses really stopped and bankrupt. It was very bad. And that time, what we saw, that clients, they just, well, probably they were really clever and they can feel that this COVID pandemic will continue for more than 1 or 2, 3 months. They just started to close their debts. And we got an extra cash. And also we had the problems with collections. What we decided to do again to cover our debts. So it means that we were very flexible. We changed. I mean, just when COVID just started, we signed an agreement with our lenders that we will not make the next repayment because we might face with the collections problem. But when we saw that our clients, it was unexpected that they are starting to close their debts, we had extra cash and we applied to our loans. We would like just to repay. It was a very surprise for them, but still we do that. And what I would like to say that during all these processes, during all these last 5 years, we were very changed. We changed our minds very quickly, very flexible. I mean, if situation is demand just to change your strategy, vice versa, we did that. And that's why somehow we managed to have even profit in our balance sheet. And then the war with Armenia in September. It make also a very bad impact to our clients. It was, everybody were very stressful. They do not want just to do anything. At that time, it was partly the lockdown, partly the war, And when the war has finished in December, the government locked down all businesses. And again, we're faced with the problems. I can continue forever, but finally now we are, almost opened and we're expecting weddings and we are expecting, the recovery. And right now, Viator, let's say we're out of money. Yeah, and we apply for the loans to our to our banks, partner banks, and also we apply to central bank just to issue bonds. This is our step for now.
Well, I really congratulate you for really still having a smile on your face after all these crises. But I think a question that we have in the chat box, and it would be great to get an answer from everyone, but I think sort of following up on just what you said, Noor, do you see a push from regulators or investors for any mergers post-crisis from what you're seeing in terms of the market in Azerbaijan? Do you see some consolidation or mergers happening? And then I'd like to get both Mr. Srinivasan and Daniel's view on that. I think it's the $1 million question, $64 million question. What do you think, Ainur?
To merge with another MFIs, you say, for example, or?
Primarily, or you might see some mergers with fintechs.
During the evaluation, we had this idea, and also we really were ready for to get some our shareholder was thinking to sell some shares just to support organization, but right now we decided not to do that. I assume that Viator really is on the recovering period, and we do not think for the merging or even just to sell our shares for now. I don't know what will happen tomorrow, but really we're open for all this, for some new tools, better tools, just to support Viator, just to develop Viator. We're open. Everything.
Do you see that happening though, perhaps with other microfinance institutions, not necessarily your own institution, but is it possible that we will see mergers in Azerbaijan of other financial institutions or microfinance institutions?
During the crisis, I will not say which bank, but there was some, one case that one MFIs wanted just to merge with the bank, but after some time they decided not to do that. I don't know what happened. Probably it was some, it was difficult with the shareholders. I don't know. But still, there are some very small MFIs, which is right now they're performing in Azerbaijan, and they really need support. I think I would recommend for them, and even during our board members in Alpha, it was somehow some recommendation that they have to merge because they are very small. But Viator is not small. I mean, Viator is middle-sized. And yeah.
Okay, great.
They would like just to come to us, I mean, to sell their shares to us. We can think about that, you know.
Yeah, just looking to see trends. And I know we had in the past weathering the storm, in Morocco, an institution that merged. Daniel, what are your thoughts on potential consolidation, mergers?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the Morocco case is interesting. So this is the case of, you can see it's in the paper, in the original Weathering the Storm paper. I'll just put the, in fact, you can see it in the project website if you download the original paper. But the case there was, you had one of the top two largest institutions in the country that was at the brink of collapse. And in that case, the central bank and other actors in the sector were very concerned that if it actually goes bankrupt, it could really destabilize the entire sector just because it was so large. And in that case, the central bank arranged a merger with another large institution that also was a subsidiary of a bank. So it had a large balance sheet and they could absorb it in full. And I think it was pretty much the only option they had at that time. I do wonder whether that necessarily meant that the sector got. If you look at Morocco now, it's a market with relatively little competition, and you went from 4 very large institutions to just 3, and that's still the case 10 years later now. So I'm a merger you might do it out of necessity, but doesn't necessarily mean in all markets it's appropriate. There's another example that comes to mind. This is actually not in Weathering the Storm, but in another paper I wrote also for CFI and CGAP. It was called, it was about responsible exits. And that case was about an MFI that was not small, I would say medium-sized MFI called Arohan. Srinivasan, you might remember them. And they were actually a really well-reputed MFI in India at the time. They had received some awards, but they were hit by the Andhra Pradesh crisis indirectly. They didn't have operations in Andhra Pradesh, but they were really affected by the liquidity squeeze that happened in response to the Andhra Pradesh crisis. And that pushed them into effectively an exit and into a sale. And the particularly the factor that made it so complex is their primary shareholder was a closed-end fund, and that closed-end fund was actually winding up. So they were at the end of their term, and they could extend that term by I think 1 or 2 years, but they certainly didn't have any new money to add, and so they were really limited with what they could do. In the end, they actually did find another institution, and they wound up merging, and it is now, I think it's called IntelliCap. It's related to something like that. Srinivasan, you might know. Anyway, I'll put a link to that paper here, in case anybody wants to check that out. But I'm going to put that in the chat. And in terms of what's happening now, I have actually heard of some examples in another market. I won't mention the name. Where that seems to be happening, where smaller institutions, the kind of example that I know was talking about, small institutions going to a large institution that is in fact very liquid, very well capitalized, and basically saying, buy out our, can we merge? And in that particular case, the response is, actually, we're really not interested in buying you. We're happy to take your clients, and that's it. So it's a really interesting situation of what's going to happen. I don't know, Srinivas, and maybe you have some more to add.
Yeah, Daniel, I think the institution you referred to, that's Arohan Financial Services. They have retained the name; it's still there.
Okay.
But the IntelliCash Group, who earlier have invested in several other microfinance institutions, they understand the market. They understood this, so they have, I think, taken a high stake in that, and Arohan has what you call prospered, become big, and all that. In general, if you look at the Indian market, I think mergers, consolidation, takeovers, they have been happening for quite some time now. Spandana, incidentally, there was a news item earlier this month saying that a bank is wanting to acquire them. There are talks on. I wouldn't say there is any authentic commentary either from the bank who wants to take over or from Spandana, but this is how news comes in. You might later on find after 2-3 months it was true. You know, the largest MFI in the country when the AP crisis hit, that was called SKS Microfinance. They rebranded themselves as Bharat Microfinance, Bharat Financial Services Limited. They, I think, IndusInd Bank acquired them. No crisis, no stress, very well capitalized, marquee investors. But then they saw a lot of strategic strengths in getting together. Because the Indian market, one thing that drives, especially banks trying to take over MFIs, is the priority sector lending mandate that the regulator has for banks. Up to 40% of their bank credit, they have to put in certain sectors, which generally service the requirements of people who do not normally get access to credit, like the microfinance clients, the micro enterprises, agriculture, and all that. Normally, this is seen as a high risk, low margin business. But microfinance is the exception to the rule. If it performs well, it produces very good returns, and the risks are pretty low, except when crisis hits them. So banks are seeing, why not I put some money to generate priority sector lending portfolio within myself instead of doing bulk lending to such institutions. So they take over some of these operations. Even as we talk, I'm sure that there are at least half a dozen conversations happening in different parts of the country. Right now, because some of the medium and small ones are having some stress, and the point that we made earlier, difficult to get equity in by the investor to sustain the MFI in its current kind of form, they are also looking at, okay, can I go and then retain at least my obligation to the customer by aligning with somebody larger? So some may be taken over by a larger MFI. Some might probably be acquired by a bank. These conversations are going on. But I think valuation, you are not going to be able to sell yourself well when you are at your worst or near your worst. People want more than a pound of flesh, a bit of the bone as well. So there are issues that come up. But then, this is happening. And the Indian market is not, meaning it's not new, but it has been happening in good time, bad time. But crisis throws up more medium and small institutions on the market. So that is something. I think, but mergers and consolidation should be seen as a very natural process. But the only thing, Daniel, is the point that you made about, I read your paper on responsible exits. Absolutely true. It doesn't mean when you want to come and acquire, what you do with the institution in future. Are you going to deny the customers who were there originally, change the entire form? You don't try and buy a small Volkswagen Beetle and convert that into a Ferrari. They have their own unique identity, what they are meant for. So are we doing that, number one? And those investors who leave, we are given, I think, hell to Axion, the good old past, when they left Compartamos. You remember that, those kind of conversations. So, meaning, we also do not want some of those kind of things to reflect. What part of that was true, untrue, that's another issue. Managing public perception when you leave, that the customers are no worse off. If possible, customers are better off. I think that will be a very good way to leave when you are exiting and when you're allowing someone else to take over and run your operation. Deb, I'll stop here. Yeah.
No, but I think that's actually a perfect way to end this session, because I think that in the end, whether it's consolidation or whatever, in the end, we need to remember who the client is and who's really the most vulnerable. And whether, consolidation is a natural process, you do want to make sure that, especially if you're a small institution with a niche, client, that those clients their needs are met some way or the other. So I think, in the end with crisis, and I think we've talked about this throughout the entire session, what is it? How do we take care of our customers? Yes, we need to remember we've got to recover growth. We've got our, the institutional goals, but in the end as well, the consumer protection, we've talked about the nano loans, all of that, how do you balance those tensions? And that could very well be the subject of another webinar, but I just want to thank all of you. And I want to thank Roshana, who had to jump off, but thanks to everyone who has been on the call and the few questions that we got from the audience. And I have promised someone I will get back to you on the question we couldn't answer. But again, thanks so much, and look forward to continued discussions and obviously continued optimism as we plow through into our recovery and sustained one. So thank you again.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you.
Bye.
I know. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks,
It's been
everyone.
nice talking to all of you. Yeah,
Yes, take
we will
care.
catch up offline. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.